Kisakwitnam, actually no, well yes, back home it would be Kisakwitnam, which is good morning, but here it would be Kisakyukit, which is good day. In Tanaha, Huagatlik Misopatki. My name is Michelle, and I'm sharing with you a little bit of Tanaha language, which is my mother tongue. So I'm going to talk about Yawunik, and what I recognized yesterday, as soon as I got here, and listening to the first few presenters about complexity and Bronfenbrenner and transformative learning and reflection and who is God and who governs whom, and that actually what I was presenting on was actually incredibly relevant as an Indigenous person, as a Tanaha knowledge holder, as part of the Tanaha knowledge relationships that I belong to. Sophie Pierre, of course, sending me here in the very first place. I came across for my 50th birthday on a trip. I ended up in Loch Ness and Inverness and actually visited Loch Ness because of the Loch Ness Monster. Because Yawunik is the water creature of our tradition. And I decided they were probably cousins. And so I would go over and, hey cousin, how you doing? What happened to you here? Since then, I'm going to jump ahead and then I'll get into the presentation. Since then, of course, COVID happened. And then I ended up in Israel last summer with one of my mentors, Daniel Bartal, who literally wrote the book on the socio-psychological framework of intractable conflict and its resolutions, and I use his text quite a lot in my teaching. And while I was there and going through many of the different archaeological sites upon which people are living now, came to recognize water creatures in different faiths and different religions and different belief systems. And my son, who is 20, actually has taken that on and has actually been doing a lot of research into water creatures in mythologies and belief systems. And so what we've discovered together is that Yawunik, this idea of this water creature, is actually quite common, and we heard, of course, the concerns about water globally. And in my home community, of course, we don't actually have drinking water. We have to bring it in. So, which is just very much thanking you for coming together with these big ideas. One of the really brilliant things that I really appreciate about Crick is that in a lot of ways we follow the Tanaha creation story in that someone calls everyone to gather and everybody comes and everybody is basically given time, space, and place to respond. To have a sense of responsibility or the ability to respond in whatever way, either by giving papers, presentations, or actually just asking the questions and getting us to think further. And I really appreciate that piece. This is a photo of water near me. I don't know if you can see the beings that are walking in that water, but I quite often take pictures of things, and when I get home I look at them and I see all these different beings and different reminders of why we believe in what we do. So after yesterday, Cedric, I think, was talking about process over model, right? And that idea that it's the process. And so one of the things that I developed probably about 15 years ago was this approach to pre-engagement ethics, especially for researchers, especially people trying to work with Indigenous peoples. Because quite often people arrive in our communities, right, and for generations and for hundreds of years, and they've got this great question, they want to answer it, and people are like, that's got nothing to do with us, right? Who are you? Why are you here? And what's happened, and I've published on this since the Crick issue, Dr. Gregory Kaheti, who is like a forefather of Native American studies, read that paper and commissioned a paper from me on research specifically and research relationships and the impact of research upon Indigenous people's knowledge systems. So basically it's like shaving off pieces of information that then go and then gets things happen to it, right? All your magic happens, and then it gets published, and then it goes somewhere else, and then it builds somebody else's careers. Meanwhile, we're stuck going, what happened to the conversations we had? And that's a huge issue right now in Canada in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because the Canadian government followed Western ethics, and they're about to destroy testimonies given by participants in the commission who told their stories of their experience in residential schools. And because people don't understand consent and ethic, they just sign the paper saying, yeah, and now they're faced with this reality of their testimonies or our oral tradition, the continuity of knowledge relationships being destroyed by the federal government. So that's just a side. So there is, of course, these human-centric relationships that we privilege as human beings, as if we're the top, right, as if we're the older brothers and sisters, and the important dialogues that need to happen, and in this case, Indigenous to non-Indigenous people. And so that first individual is sort of the leader, or who calls together that conversation. And so talking to Sophie, obviously, right, she's telling me, you need to go. I'm saying, no, you should send my cousin Chris. He's got the PhD. I left mine. No, you need to go, and so on and so on. And then more often than not, though, we're meeting with non-Indigenous people who are coming along who are ready to have conversations or help us or fix something or address something, and without really knowing who we are. Oops. So in my teaching, because that's predominantly what I do these days, and in, where did you go? He's not here. Okay. He was talking about raising the next generation of intellectual interpreters, is what I call them. And so I've been working a lot with younger generations for probably 30 years, building summer or off-school opportunities such as youth governance, and opportunities for them to develop their skills in how do you facilitate, how do you do project management, how do you even come up with an idea of what do you want to do, and then how do you organize, how do you host people to come in and have that conversation. And so a lot of what I use is a lot of academic work, but I translate it and I help interpret and translate concepts that may be very, very academic, but into that conversational. And we were talking about that yesterday. Somebody had mentioned that, using the language or shifting the language until other people start to pick up that language and it becomes part of their language. But the other side of that, what I do is also go back to Tanakha knowledge holders who speak the language to ask them, what is this concept in our language? What does it mean? And they never horizontally translate. There's never a horizontal translation. There's always and this is what this means. And so I've been doing that since my master's thesis, when I asked people, what is the perception of the welfare of our children, instead of child welfare is. Because we know in Western society what child welfare is, but we did not necessarily have documented for us what does the welfare of our people mean to us, which came out with a different model. And so this just goes back to Canada's desire now to destroy data, and that it reflects our Canadian social policy. This is a quote from Jody Wilson-Raybould. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her. She is also known as Pugless. She was our Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, the first Indigenous woman, an Indigenous person to hold such an office in the Canadian government, and the Trudeau government got rid of her for trying to keep the government accountable on a number of different questionable situations. And so she just published her latest book in December 2022, and I was really, really happy because I've not seen a lot of Indigenous people use this term, intractable. And so when I came back after 2018 and I started using this term and asking people, because we're used to being Indian problems, Indigenous people are problems, we're in the way of development, we're this, we're that, we're backwards, et cetera, et cetera. But for myself, after spending time here, I'm like, oh yeah, it's a total intractable conflict, I get it. And of course, that's what I wrote about in 2019. And so for somebody like Jody to come along and be able to recognize that it's intractable was like a huge, like, yes, we're getting somewhere. We're starting to have these conversations. Because I was talking to John and to others about hosting Indigenous peoples to have this conversation, because we're not getting anywhere. And in fact, a lot of the interventions, a lot of the work we're doing is actually getting us further and further away from who we are, because we're called Indigenous people, we're called First Nations, so we're being reorganized, re-territorialized in our own identities. And that's causing huge havoc, and we see that in our younger generations. That inherent right to identity that people, human beings have, we don't have as Indigenous people. We don't have that inherent right to speak our languages or be raised according to custom and tradition in our families of origin, in our homelands, et cetera, et cetera. And this is intergenerational. This is part of the problem, the intractability, right? And when we look at Daniel Bartol's work and his framework around how he defines in terms of intergenerational narratives, right? The protection, what we celebrate, we're doing that today, these days. So in my community, we're celebrating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is designed by the Canadian government, and we do a walk. Each of our bands walk the road that their people would have walked towards taking their children to the residential school, which is in the heart of my community. So Indigenous means to be a place. And it's used now as a much broader definition. But to Indigenous peoples, like the quote says, I'm not going to read this for you, but we emerge from a place, there's a certain amount of spirituality and belief system. And Dennis McPherson, another Anishinaabeg mentor of mine, literally wrote the book called Indian from the Inside, which is very much about Indigenous philosophy and the generational task we have about rebuilding our intellectual interpreters. So we have our political interpreters, we have our spiritual or our cultural interpreters, but what has been erased for us, a lot of Indigenous people, is our intellectual interpreters, people like myself. We tend to see these words like elders, right, which are very ageist, and not based on our model of how we learn from each other. We learn from everyone, and it's based on skill sets, it's based on a whole bunch of different belief systems. And so myself, I'm a Tanakh knowledge holder, not in that I have traditional knowledge as in certain pieces, but in how I come and go, and my namesake. Of Michelle, who I'm named after, and the traits, the characteristics that person had that I never met, that I actually carry forward as well. I go to places like this, where most Tanakh would be, and do say to me, why do you do that? And then we have great conversations about, oh, well, they gather in this big group, and then they ask questions of each other, and they start to see the point of the intellectual interpretation and the value. So yesterday, I think it was Alan and James were talking about the critical reflection. And so Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who is, God, I'm going to say it incorrectly, but Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara, he has written about the 5 criticals, and so I share this with students all the time. It's not just about critical thinking, but it's also about critical perspective. And so in a class, if you were in my class, you couldn't sit in the same spot every day. You'd have to move. You'd have to move to be able to see another perspective of what you're witnessing. And it's the same with our creation story, right? Bear does not have to be, all living things are called together, and grizzly bear does not have to be the same as Inuk. And most people like to think, well, grizzly bear is really, really tough, except Inuk, there's stories about Mouse where he's incredibly powerful because he actually eats a criminal case in a court in the 1800s that actually freed a Tanakh person. and it's in the newspaper that this actually happened. And so we're taught all the time that, you know, size isn't actually what matters. It's skill and its ability and to hone those things. People were talking about complex change. So I come from a social work background. That's my degrees, interdisciplinary degrees. And so in social work, this is probably 25 years ago now, talking about complex change at the personal and collective level. And so we kind of came up with this equation of what does it mean. And more often than not, and especially in reconciliation and resolution of conflict, we end up over here, especially in First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, but also with those that are coming to help us when things don't actually sustain change. And so we're, of course, looking for sustained peace, which means we have to really think about what's missing in this. And usually it's funding related, it's the longevity, it's the project management, which has a cycle, right, which is not actually a human life cycle. It's an accounting cycle of some sort. So where am I talking about? I'm talking about right here. That is where I'm from. It is the Columbia and Kootenay rivers. And at a time they were connected, and that is where Yawunik lived, the water creature. And so the landscape is essentially a dialogue. We have place names. We have a belief that if we have a name for a place, we probably know it, and we know it for what its role is in our lived experiences, as well as what it provides to us and what we provide back to it. So it's a lot about that ability to respond. So not just responsibility like this, but to care for the land, and it will take care of us as well. And so we have 7 land districts, and each are named for the place as it is. So the most well-known one right now is Kokinamakis, which is in here, and Kokin is Raven, and it is named Raven's Land because it's coal mining. It's a tech mine field. And so we know that we had harvested or produced coal in the past. We used coal. Coal is one of the living things because everything, the idea of all living things is not just human beings or something with a heartbeat as we know it, as we measure it, but we know that all living things includes things like coal because it's energy. This is why we mine all these things. It's for the energy. And we were talking a little bit about that, I think, earlier when we were talking about chips. Yep. Okay. So there's a time before the human beings, and I keep hearing it. Okay, never mind. That's outside. I'm very nervous. I'm going to run out of time. So there's archaeological evidence that the rivers were connected. There's also archaeological evidence of a fossilized creature in that area that no longer exists. And so we have actually named it Yawunik because of the shape of it and what it looks like. And so we know that a lot of our creation story can be now traced back and validated through Western science some 10,000 years later. And so Yawunik happens to go around and has this relationship to place, but something happens to Yawunik. I don't know that part of the story. I've asked a lot of people about that. But what I came to recognize is that from Yawunik, the human beings are made. And Yawunik stops paying attention to natural law, stops behaving in a proper manner, starts eating everything, is a bit unruly, and so he ends up getting hunted. He's always a he for some reason. I don't know why, but I don't believe that. But anyways, goes around killing everything and finally is hunted. And what happens is, out of that water creature, all human beings are made out of that creature. And so for myself and my son, we've been talking a lot about trauma and about how do you resolve this kind of trauma? How do you resolve any kind of trauma? And what I've been noticing in my people is that the interventions we're getting use a broad stroke about what trauma is and what it isn't. And so we've started looking at the fact, and this happened after COVID, because not a lot of people talk about COVID time as a historical trauma upon the human beings, which it was, because we all went through it, and the animals were quite happy about it because they started coming back to the cities, right, and reclaiming space. And then there's the intergenerational trauma of COVID, which is we don't even know yet how that's going to play out socially and emotionally. But when we are only living with the people we were safe to do so, our ways of being, doing, and knowing started to shift, right? You were only spending time with the people you loved. I use quotes there. Okay, that's a joke. And then there's the developmental trauma, right? For all of us, because development doesn't end in childhood, it actually ends when we pass away, right? And that's a piece that we don't often think about. And then there's the ambiguous loss, right? Just not knowing what's going to happen next. And then, of course, there is the acute trauma, deaths and sicknesses and so on and so forth. And so one of the reasons why I've been looking at the Fist of Uwunik is to better understand what do we need to do if we're going to actually be human beings, being in relationship with each other and supporting each other. And so, looking at Indigenous self-development. And so another quote from Jody, very, very long, but talking about cooperation, I think is what we were talking about yesterday again, and about understanding that it's a lot harder and it takes more strength to truly cooperate than to choose to fight. And we are always primed to fight, right? If you, any sort of reaction to something, you immediately put your hand in a fist. And this is coming from my son, who's a 20-year-old, 6'4", obvious-looking Indigenous man who deals with racism on a regular basis. And, you know, he's like, yeah, if I have to, but he also wants to shift that cycle. He wants to figure out how to do this differently. How do we get to that place? And so it's having the strength to change. So the creation story I use as a methodology and a pedagogy in teaching classes and working with different people, including my own people, and invoking the creation story. And I'm just going to jump forward because I know I'm running out of time. Skamnintik. Skamnintik is the word for children in Ktunaxa. And Skamnintik is it started out as a non-profit society. It's only a year old. It is of people who had attended the Kootenai Indian Residential School and their descendants, so myself, because I have 4 generations ahead that have gone, and Sophie Pierre has gone to that school as well. And so they've started because our political institutions and our nonprofits that are getting all the funding for us are actually not meeting our needs. They're following the policies of Western society, right? That says, this is what a family is, this is what health is, this is what this is, this is what this is. And a lot of the work that we need to do for ourselves in bringing back our identity and reaffirming our identity and revitalizing our language and practicing our culture and making space to practice our culture, such as my son carries a knife, he goes hunting, he's not allowed to use a knife because the society says you have to be a certain age to be able to use a knife. And yet our boys at a very young age are supposed to be playing with things like this because they're tools. We just had fires. I'm not sure if you heard about all the fires in British Columbia, but one of those was actually on our reserve. We had actually practiced traditional burn, and that traditional burn took 5 years to practice because the decolonization to have that happen was actually removing the fuel that had basically accumulated as a result of land policy on the reserve by the federal and provincial governments. So we had to literally spend 5 years removing the fuel so that we could actually practice our traditional burn. And that traditional burn actually saved the international airport in Cranbrook. And it saved half the houses on the reserve, and we only lost 7 houses. And so this is an example of why Tk'emnintik and an organization such as this is desperately needed, because we can work outside of those boundaries. And we're hoping to, well, now they've got me doing this, but working towards becoming a social enterprise so that we can be doing the programming as we know, including having the center, having, because it's situated in the residential school building. We're the only standing residential school still in existence in the territory, so that we can bring people there to learn, including other Indigenous scholars, to have conversations like this. And we were this close through the College of the Rockies in 2022, to actually being able to make it happen. And then there was a bit of a shift, and so we're still working towards bringing Indigenous people together to have these sorts of conversations, for Tk'emnintik to house conversations specific to Indigenous peoples globally on intractable conflict.